The field of clinical psychology begins to resemble more and more geometry, or even worse, trigonometry. Everyone and his dog and his mother-in-law keeps coming up with triads and tetrads. I even proposed a few years ago a dark pentagram. So, luckily, I have a doctorate in physics, so I am a survivor in this ever-changing field. Today we're going to discuss another variant of dark triad personality and, believe it or not, a light triad. What else would they think of next? Okay, and who am I? Apropos dark triad. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and I'm a professor of psychology. Now, before we proceed, it's very important to remind you, people with dark personalities are not narcissists. They are not psychopaths. They are not borderlines. People with dark personalities are subclinical. In other words, they cannot be diagnosed with any personality disorder. They have a style. They have a narcissistic style, replete with narcissistic traits and narcissistic behaviors, or they have a psychopathic style with a few features of psychopathy, such as, for example, defiance and recklessness. But these people with dark personalities do not have the depth and background of a true, full-fledged, echt, authentic personality disorder. Therefore, they cannot be diagnosed. So when we say a dark triad personality, we're talking about someone who is a subclinical narcissist, a subclinical psychopath, someone who cannot be diagnosed as a narcissist or a psychopath, coupled with Machiavellianism, manipulativeness. In the description, you will find links to two videos. One of them discusses the very confusing concept of dark tetrad and how even experienced clinicians are at a loss sometimes. And the second video describes my proposition, the dark pentagram, which puts together all the known dark triads and all the known dark tetrads in a complete holistic model. But today, as I said, we're going to discuss the vulnerable dark triad and later on the light triad. Okay, I would like to start by reading to you the abstract of a very early article, 2010. It was written by Miller, Gentile, and Pryor and others, and it is titled Vulnerable Dark Triad, Comparing Factor II Psychopathy, Vulnerable Narcissism, and Borderline Personality Disorder. It was published in Journal of Personality, and it is the pioneering study on vulnerable dark triad. And this is what the abstract has to say. Paul Hudson Williams in 2002 identified a dark triad comprised the following related personality styles: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. The heterogeneity found in narcissism and psychopathy raises the possibility of a second triad made up of emotional vulnerability and dark traits. In other words, the vulnerable dark triad, or VDT. Along with vulnerable narcissism and factor II psychopathy, the third member of the hypothesized VDT is borderline personality disorder, or BPD. The results suggest that the VDT constructs are significantly related to one another and manifest similar nomological networks, particularly vulnerable narcissism and BPD. Although the VDT members, the vulnerable dark triad members, are related to negative emotionality and antagonistic interpersonal styles, they are also related to introversion and disinhibition. Ultimately, say the authors, it seems there is a dark continuum of pathological personality traits that differ primarily in relation to negative and positive emotionality and disinhibition. So what is it that we're talking about? What is a vulnerable dark triad? As the authors suggested 15 years ago, the vulnerable dark triad comprises three similar constructs which are also interrelated: vulnerable or fragile narcissism, secondary psychopathy as distinct from primary psychopathy, and borderline personality traits. I wish to remind you that there is ongoing work which deals with the secondary psychopathy phases or manifestations of borderline personality disorder. When the borderline is under severe stress, when she anticipates, for example, abandonment and rejection, she decompensates, she loses her defenses, and she begins to act out, externalizing aggression, and that renders the borderline indistinguishable from a secondary psychopath. You can read more about it by visiting the borderline playlist on this channel. Back to the vulnerable dark triad. People who are highly affected by the dark triad are influenced usually by external, controllable factors. In other words, the classical dark triad, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, is reactive. It is public-facing. It is intended to manipulate people, to obtain secure, favorable outcomes from the environment. We could therefore say that classical dark triads are revolve around the issue of self-efficacy. The dark triad combo self-enhances and increases self-efficacy. On the other hand, on the contrary, people who are high in vulnerable dark triad qualities are driven by internal, embedded issues. In other words, the classical dark triad is reactive. It's about self-enhancement of a sense of self-worth, and it's about self-efficacy. Whereas the vulnerable dark triad is introverted, it's internal, and it's a reaction to psychodynamics, psychological processes and dynamics in the individual. Another very seminal article in the field of vulnerable dark triad is the article authored by Gamache, Mahou-Caron, and others. They're all from Quebec in Canada. And the article is titled Revisiting the Vulnerable Dark Triad Hypothesis Using a Bifactor Model. It was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Psychology in 2023. So it's a very new article. And the question that the authors posed at the very inception of the article is, might the dark triad personality have a vulnerable side? People with dark triad personalities are not or may not be as strong as you think. You see, people with dark triad personalities project this invulnerability, this invincibility, this untouchability. They are sang-froid, they are cool-headed, they are like, they have it all together. And this projection, this emanation is very charismatic and very convincing and very irresistible and alluring. Whereas people with vulnerable dark triad personalities are usually insecure. They are emotionally dysregulated. They're all over the place, all over the map, and so on and so forth. But what several authors are trying to imply, several scholars, is that even the classical dark triad is a compensatory facade. It seems to imply that the dark triad is vulnerable by definition, but there are two ways to go about it. Some people compensate for this vulnerability by pretending to be godlike. And these people are narcissistic and psychopathic. Other people are more borderline. They're more introverted. They tend to their wounds in isolation. They avoid reality. They withdraw. They constrict. The key points from the article by Gamache and others is that the dark triad is thought of as a set of qualities based on a strong foundation in self-confidence. But new research, say the authors, new research on the vulnerable dark triad shows people with these qualities suffer from severe self-doubts. Avoid the negative effects on your own ability to succeed and feel good about yourself, advise the authors. Okay, so people with classical dark triad personality traits, they are confident, they're charismatic, they're manipulative, they're Machiavellian, they're grandiose, they lack empathy, or they have reduced empathy. And the first association, when I tell you dark triad personality, dark, it's like the Batman movies. The first association is that these people really have their act together. They are really strong. They know where they're going. They're confident. They are visionaries, and so on and so forth. And probably many chief executive officers, politicians, leaders, probably many of them have dark triad traits. But it may all be a facade in some way. There's an overlap between these traits, and this suggests a certain rashness, recklessness, supreme belief in one's own powers. But is it all compensatory? Now, let me be clear before I proceed so that I don't mislead you. Currently, the perception is that there are two types of dark triad: the classical, narcissistic, psychopathic, and the vulnerable, and they have nothing to do with each other. I suggest that all types of dark triads are compensatory in some way, that at the base, at the foundation, the dark triad personality is unstable, dysregulated, vulnerable, fragile, self-doubting, perhaps with some kind of inferiority complex. At the core, I suggest, all dark triad personalities are covert. Some of them choose an overt compensatory presentation. They become narcissistic and psychopathic. Others choose to withdraw and avoid and introvert. These are the borderlines. So there is a vulnerable side to narcissism. We all know that. But is there also a weakness in some people with dark triad personalities? Or all of them, maybe? So these people, even when they have power, even when they are driven, even when they project confidence and emanate charisma, and even when they prevail and win, and so on and so forth, they never seem to take much pleasure in having come out on top. They're never joyful. They're never cheerful. Or if they are, it doesn't last long. It's kind of euphoria or elation, which immediately dissipates and evaporates. And this is a strong indication that there is something there under the facade, an engine of self-doubt, something that chastises and disparages and castigates and criticizes, kind of a harsh inner critic, kind of a superego there that's too sadistic and too imposing. That's why these people can never be happy. Never mind the circumstances. Never mind if they've won the competition. Never mind if they have subjugated their subordinates and employees or prevailed over their enemies. They're never happy. And when we see a situation where someone is never happy, never joyful, never cheerful, never elated in the long term, then this is a strong indication of some core, some internal problem that is the engine or from which the facade emanates. this front, this self-aggrandizing front is just a shell. When these people are alone, they voice self-doubts. They express strong and enduring self-flagellation, which borders on self-hatred. They also tend to be self-defeating and self-destructive. It's as if they are possessed of some internalized bad object, a constellation of introjects and voices that keeps informing them that they are failures, that they are inadequate, that they should do more, that they are never up to scratch, that all their accomplishments are inferior and temporary, and so on and so forth. These voices drive them mad, drive them what you see as ambition, what you see as drive, what you see as inexorable move forward, what you see as vision. It's all actually a desperate attempt to silence these internal voices. There is a disconnect between outer presentation and inner turmoil and tumult. We say that there is a gap or an abyss between implicit self-esteem and explicit self-esteem, and this gap generates anxiety, dissonance, and the dissonance generates anxiety and drives the individual to self-enhance, to be preoccupied with narcissistic supply, with power, with accomplishing goals, and so on and so forth. All these people are exemplars or members of the dark triad, but there's something in them that doesn't seem to fit the category. And this is why Miller and his collaborators in 2010 introduced the concept of the vulnerable dark triad. And surprisingly, it's a much neglected field. It didn't receive as much attention as the classical dark triad, maybe because it's a lot less sexy. This vulnerable dark triad is a combination of what we would colloquially call evil and weakness, inward weakness, outward evil. Now, evil is not a term in clinical psychology, last time I checked, and it conjures up religion and morality plays and things that don't belong in psychology. But in colloquial terms, in pedestrian, quotidian, day-to-day life, these people are vicious. They're wicked, they're malevolent, they're malicious, passive-aggressively or aggressively, openly or covertly, but they are. And at the same time, they harbor this sense of fragility, vulnerability, frailty, weakness, these axes and vectors of potential attack, these chinks in the armor. They have panache, they're glib, they have superficial charm, they're charismatic, they're visionaries, they're leaders, they're attention-grabbing or attention-seeking, they are charming, irresistibly so sometimes, but underneath it all, there lurks evil. The evil can manifest in a narcissistic way, a psychopathic way, or in a borderline way, but it's there. And Dominique Gamache and his colleagues from the Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières took this VDT, Vulnerable Dark Triad construct, they took it a bit further, and they tried to ask themselves some very fundamental and critical questions. And again, you have literature in the description. And they suggested, they introduced what they called the D factor. D, like D, the letter D, D factor in personality. They said that there's no need to limit the dark triad construct to narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. We could introduce the D factor. And the D factor includes much neglected traits or trait domains and much neglected behaviors such as callousness, deceitfulness, vindictiveness, sadism, and entitlement. So in Vulnerable Dark Triad, the original Miller formulation proposed that it's mainly associated with borderline personality disorder, vulnerable narcissism, the reckless and impulsive component of psychopathy, the part that gets people in trouble. But this is a very limited view, and Gamache and others pushed it forward in the past 2 or 3 years. The original pattern, the Miller VDT, would fit toxic people. Toxic people torment other people. They impinge and infringe and impact other people adversely. There's no debate about this. But they're also self-defeating and self-destructive, and they impact themselves, torment themselves as well. Even when they commit acts that are antisocial in nature, from the inside, there's something that is eating away at them. Their feelings that they're weak, they're failures, they're stupid, they're ugly. This is called the internalized bad object, used to be called the primitive superego by Strachey in 1938. So, personality researchers, scholars of personality, are trying to move beyond these highly demarcated, rigid categories of personality disorders, especially in the diagnostic and statistical manual. There is a kind of gravitation towards the alternative model in the DSM and or the much more flexible, much more updated version in the International Classification of Diseases, zoning in on clusters of underlying trait domains or traits seems to be much more faithful to reality, much more authentic than going through bullet lists or shopping lists of criteria, diagnostic criteria. We should focus not on diagnoses, but on traits. These traits are expressed in various behavioral patterns. They're like swirls in a pond, you know, and the same individual could have different vortices, different swirls, different presentations depending on circumstances, on the environment, on interpersonal relationships, on internal stressors, on external adverse circumstances, and so on. As things change internally and externally, we are in flux. And if we are prone to mental illness, this flux would mean that we cannot be shoehorned or boxed into a categorical drawer. So we need a lot more flexibility. And there are disturbances in cognition, the way of thinking, in behavior, in relating to others, emotional, and so on and so forth. And these disturbances, these disorders, are common in dark triad personalities and in vulnerable dark triad personalities. It's true that the emphases are different, but I personally think that a lot more connects them than separates them. And that's why I propose a unifying theory of dark personalities in my video on the dark pentagram, which I encourage you to watch. Now, there are two critical dimensions, indisputable in all the literature, two critical dimensions in vulnerable dark triads. One of these dimensions is very reminiscent of borderline personality disorder. And this includes self-hatred or self-rejection, self-punishment, feelings of worthlessness, and the belief that one has no right to be alive. In other words, suicidal ideation. These all emanate, these are the contributions of the borderline personality organization or personality style to the vulnerable dark triad. And of course, emotional dysregulation goes without saying. And this general factor that is being discussed in vulnerable dark triad includes other qualities such as inattention, dissonance, shame, mood cycling, meaninglessness, fascination with death, and self-disgust. So this is the first dimension. We can call it the borderline-like or the pseudo-borderline dimension in vulnerable dark triad. But there's a second dimension where these qualities are much more reminiscent of narcissism psychopathy complex, the narcissism psychopathy complex. So The second dimension includes traits or behaviors such as recklessness, lack of premeditation, always getting in trouble, venting frustrations, entitlement, avoiding ungrateful others, wanting to get all that one deserves or thinks one deserves, hiding or masking, feeling weak for relying on other people, feeling shame and anxiety over one's needs, and so on and so forth. These are all pseudo-psychopathic or pseudo-narcissistic features. The classic concept in the study of personality is that there is a P factor, P, like the letter P, a P factor. P, of course, P, of course, I'm sorry. Wow, that was a bad one. P, of course, is the first letter in the word psychopathology. And the authors believe that their findings, and I'm quoting, point to the role of a profound self-hatred, arguably rooted in negative self-representations imbued with hostility and aggression. End quote. However, the first factor is heavily reminiscent or weighted toward borderline personality disorder, the qualities of a borderline. And Vulnerable Dark Triad is not borderline. You remember, dark personalities are subclinical. And so this raises the question, if we have basically most of the important elements in borderline personality disorder present in Vulnerable Dark Triad, and if we insist that Vulnerable Dark Triad is not borderline personality disorder, what gives? What is the distinction? Is it, for example, the level of intensity? Or is it that only certain clusters appear and others don't? Or is it that certain clusters appear at one time and other traits appear clustered at another time? All these possibilities are open. The authors state borderline pathology may be quite unique among personality disorders in how it can be defined as a pathology in self and other representation. So it's possible to have a borderline personality organization. It's possible to have borderline traits. It's possible to have a borderline style and yet not be a borderline. And it's not an attenuated version of borderline personality disorder, but it's a kind of internal dysregulation or chaos, which is very reminiscent of borderline. And that is the borderline or pseudo-borderline element in Vulnerable Dark Triad. The next article I would like you to consider and read was written by Bonfá-Araujo, Schermer, and others, and it is titled Unveiling the Fragile Facade, a scoping review and meta-analysis of the Vulnerable Dark Triad. It was published in the magazine Personality and Individual Differences in 2024, so it's pretty recent, and I would like actually to read to you the abstract and the introduction because they're well written and they give us an overview of the current state of thinking about dark personalities. Start with the highlights of the article. Emotional instability is the core of the Vulnerable Dark Triad. Difficulties in emotional regulation and impulsive behaviors are highly associated with the Vulnerable Dark Triad. All studies were published with WEIRD. WEIRD is an acronym. Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic populations. So studies do not represent non-Western populations, such as in Africa or parts of Asia and so on. Okay, here's the abstract. The Vulnerable Dark Triad, secondary psychopathy, vulnerable narcissism, and borderline personality, was proposed in 2010 as a counterpart of the Dark Triad and combines socially undesirable behaviors with emotionally vulnerable traits. Despite being proposed more than a decade ago, no study to our knowledge has sought to map the existing evidence, which is pretty shocking, may I add. The abstract continues. Our results indicate that all vulnerable dark triad traits are intercorrelated. Furthermore, emotional instability is the vulnerable triad core. All traits are positively associated with impulsive behaviors, difficulties in emotional regulation, and higher rejection sensitivity. The vulnerable dark triad, factor 2 psychopathy, vulnerable narcissism, and borderline personality, was proposed more than 10 years ago and hitherto not studied. The interplay of vulnerable behaviors can lead to complex patterns of emotional instability, a fragile sense of self, relationship difficulties, and manipulative tendencies, according to Gamache and others. Considering the current growth and interest in aversive or dark behaviors and possible structural models, such as Moshagen's model in 2018, is it necessary to map all available evidence to better understand how and why such behaviors occur and to provide evidence about the possible differences between already existing models, such as the dark triad or versus the dark core? Yes, it is of course needed and necessary. The first trait of the vulnerable dark triad is factor 2 psychopathy. Psychopathy is a personality disorder characterized by interpersonal manipulation, callousness, lack of empathy, and impulsivity. Considering one of its initial understandings, there are two dimensions of psychopathy, according to Blackburn in 2009. Factor 1 is related to interpersonal and affective behaviors. Grandiosity and lack of remorse are examples. Factor 2, also called antisocial lifestyle, encompasses behaviors related to a person's deviant lifestyle and interpersonal difficulties. Factor 2 psychopathy includes superficial charm, deceitfulness, manipulativeness, impulsivity, and irresponsible behavior, a tendency to engage in risky activities, and a history of criminal or antisocial behavior. And they refer to work by Blackburn, Hare, Miller, and others. Furthermore, the authors continue, higher scores on factor 2 psychopathy are associated with unstable and chaotic lives, marked by difficulties maintaining stable employment or relationships, engaging in different forms of substance abuse, and having legal problems, according to Patrick, 2006. Factor 2 psychopathy is associated with a lack of long-term goals and a tendency to live in the moment without much consideration for the consequences, which can lead to a pattern of impulsive and destructive behavior. They quote work by Yildirim and Dirksen in 2015. It is worth mentioning that not all individuals with psychopathy exhibit high scores on both factors 1 and 2, as some may be more prominently characterized by one dimension rather than the other. Actually, I'm interjecting here. This is the case. People are diagnosed either with primary or secondary. It's extremely rare to be diagnosed with both. Okay, back to the introduction in the article that I've mentioned, and you can find all the articles in the literature in the description. Back to the text. The second trait of the vulnerable dark triad is vulnerable narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism is characterized by an underlying fragility and sensitivity, often camouflaged underneath a facade of modesty and self-doubt. People with high levels of vulnerable narcissism have an excessive need for admiration and validation, and are prone to feelings of inadequacy and inferiority, which may lead to chronic self-doubt and a fear of rejection. One of the central features of vulnerable narcissism is hypersensitivity to criticism and perceived insults, which can trigger intense emotional reactions such as shame and resentment. Thus, higher scores on vulnerable narcissism measures tend to exhibit passive-aggressive behaviors and engage in self-pity to look for sympathy and support from others. and they mention early work by Hendin and Cheek in 1997. While not displaying the overt superiority found in grandiose narcissism, vulnerable narcissists have an underlying worry about their needs and desires. Furthermore, vulnerable narcissists have difficulty preserving close relationships, as their constant need for reassurance and tendency to respond defensively to criticism can weaken interpersonal interactions, according to Lamkin, 2015. Borderline personality represents the final piece of the vulnerable dark triad. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive instability in emotions, self-image, interpersonal relationships, and behaviors. People with borderline personality disorders struggle with extreme and rapidly shifting emotions, including episodes of intense sadness, anger, and anxiety, according to Gunderson in 2018. One of the hallmark attributes of borderline personality disorder is affective and behavioral dysregulation in interpersonal relationships, intense attachments, and fear of abandonment. This instability can result in challenging relationships, dramatic fluctuations in how individuals perceive others, and a pattern of idealization and evaluation. They refer to work by Ring and others. It should be noted, the authors continue, that just like the dark triad, the vulnerable dark triad's 3 traits should be considered subclinical versions of the disorders, and that behaviors associated with these traits do not reach the intensity or presence to warrant a clinical diagnosis of these disorders. Regarding construct overlap, vulnerable narcissism and borderline personality traits share associated characteristics, including emotional instability and a fragile sense of self. Both traits reflect a greater sensitivity to perceived criticism, which may lead to extreme emotional reactions and difficulty preserving stable relationships. Again, they refer to work by Gunderson and Miller. Both borderline personality and factor 2 psychopathy involve impulsive behavior. However, the core of impulsivity differs. Borderline traits manifest as reckless behavior driven by emotional dysregulation, while psychopathy involves impulsivity in seeking immediate gratification with a disregard for consequences. Vulnerable narcissism and factor 2 psychopathy also share similarities in interpersonal manipulation and a desire for personal advantage. But the underlying reasons differ because vulnerable narcissism originates from insecurity and a need for external validation, while factor 2 psychopathy typically reflects a parasitic lifestyle and a poor behavioral control approach to interpersonal manipulation. In the DVT context, when these traits converge, the result is characterized by individuals who manipulate others to cope with emotional vulnerability and emotion dysregulation. So this was an excellent way to end the section on vulnerable dark triad. Shockingly, there's also a light triad. Light triad, it may come as a surprise to you, is the absolute exact opposite of the dark triad. The scales of the light triad represent concepts in positive psychology. The idea was first proposed by Laura Johnson in a master's thesis. She wrote a master's thesis in 2018. And the light triad comprises 3 personality traits. These personality traits tend to manifest together, and they promote individual and collective well-being. The first personality trait, Laura Johnson called Kantianism, after the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Don't ask. Kantianism manifests in the tendency to treat people as ends, not as means, not to use people, not to abuse people, but to regard people as important, not as means to achieve a goal, but as a goal. Interactions with people, positive emotionality, compassion, attentiveness, love All these are perceived as residing in others. Others are repositories of positivity. People with high levels of Kantianism show a deep respect for human dignity, and they make decisions based on universal ethical principle. And so they are altruistic, charitable, pro-social, truly communal, but not self-sacrificial. They have boundaries. They're healthy. The second trait in the light triad is humanism. It's a fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature and in the fact that every human being has a potential and seeks self-actualization. People with a high level of this trait, the trait of humanism, believe in the capacity of human beings for growth, for personal development, for improvement. They tend to see the best in other people. They're not Pollyannish. They're not naive. They're not stupid. They know that there are evil people out there. But they give you some credit. They give you a chance. They presume, correctly by the way, that statistically speaking, most people are good. And this translates into supportive behavior, empathy, and the propensity to make meaningful connections with other people. The third trait sounds a lot like humanism, but is not. It is faith in humanity, trusting people in the present rather than future potential, whereas humanism focuses on the future potential of people. Faith in humanity embraces them as they are, trusts them as they are. People with this trait of faith in humanity believe in the fundamental honesty and goodness of people. They maintain an optimistic attitude, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary, as long as this evidence is not overwhelming. Of course, these three traits are mutually reinforcing. If you have a Kantian view of human dignity, then you would tend to assume the best about people. You would tend to support them because you trust their potential, and this fuels further belief in human nature and human potential, and so on and so forth. So they are mutually reinforcing, and this creates what could be called a pro-social orientation, constructive and cooperative behavior. There's been some research done, believe it or not, on the light triad. People with high levels in light triad traits develop more satisfying and long-lasting relationships. They exhibit greater levels of psychological well-being. They contribute more actively to the common good. They manifest greater psychological resilience in the face of adversity. And they demonstrate greater success in ethical conduct and even ethical leadership. The dark triad dominates the field, obviously. Dark triad is about negative personality traits and so on. The light triad is anticorrelated with the dark triad. It's the opposite of dark triad. It stands to reason, therefore, that someone who scores high on the dark triad would score low on the light triad, and vice versa. If you score high on the light triad, you could never score high on the dark triad. But surprisingly, studies didn't find this. What studies discovered is that the anticorrelation between light triad and dark triad is very weak. It exists, mind you, let me be clear, but it's much weaker than expected. Light triad, therefore, is not the opposite of dark triad, which is pretty shocking. It means that you could be a dark triad personality and possess some light triad traits, and vice versa. You could be a light triad personality and possess some dark triad traits. Johnson defined the light triad as prosocial. Kaufman defined it as loving. Jerimsky and Krok defined it as caring. Lukic and Zivanovic defined it as benevolent. All kinds of positive personality traits entered the work of Ramos Vera and others. All these scholars were very positive about the light triad by definition. And gradually, As usual in psychology, there was a debate. Johnson said that the light triad consists of empathy, compassion, and altruism. Kaufman suggested that the light triad is a different set of traits: faith in humanity, humanism, and Kantianism. So now there's this Kaufman versus Johnson model. The first light triad construct was proposed, as I said, by Johnson. She defined the light triad as pro-social orientation, empathy, compassion, altruism, as I said before. Empathy is the experience or reaction to another person's emotions, state of mind, and circumstances. The ability to recognize others, that is cognitive and reflexive empathy, or cold empathy, and then the ability to understand and react emotionally to the condition of another person, which is affective empathy. But empathy is not necessarily a part of the light triad, surprisingly and shockingly. And we are entering here a territory with the work of Johnson, with the work of Kaufman. We're entering a territory that is very new and very surprising and introduces nuances into our morality play, into our splitting defenses. Narcissists and psychopaths are all bad. If you are dark triad, you can never be light triad. We're beginning to see that people are much more complex, much more compounded. You could be a dark triad personality in certain circumstances with certain people, and you could be light triad personality with other people and other circumstances, other environments. It's not that simple. And this tendency online by self-styled experts and their unfortunate followers to divide everything into black and white, right and wrong, evil and all good, this is not only infantile, it's narcissistic. This is what narcissists do. They split everything into black and white, good and evil. This is a primitive defense mechanism, which is one of the founding pillars of narcissism. If you split the narcissist, if you say the narcissist is dark, is all bad, is all evil, you are being a narcissist, actually. Unpleasant to hear, but there's the truth for you.